So thanks everybody for being here. Thanks everybody for being a bit patient while we sort of worked out the tech. I appreciate you guys have a packed schedule, so I will try to kind of be a little bit speedy as I sort of go through this. This talk is kind of going to draw on some research that comes out of my book, which will be out in November from Columbia University Press. It's called When Companies Rule. I'll have a QR code and a like discount link for you guys towards the end, and then some kind of newer research that I'm trying to do that is responding really kind of specifically to this moment that we're living through now with the kind of the political rise of the tech oligarchs and their insertion of themselves into um, you know, American politics and world politics, and trying to understand kind of what the implications of that are. And so I'm kind of going to draw the two projects together a bit in this talk, and where it feels disjointed, that's why. But um, and then in both of these projects, I am a political scientist by training, and before that was a business and financial journalist for a while. And so, I should say that I'm not primarily, kind of a cultural studies academic, but I am somebody who uses kind of fiction and science fiction, speculative fiction specifically, to kind of open up some of my scholarship on these sort of real world contemporary corporations. So that's all kind of a bit of preamble. I'd like to start with a tweet, and a tweet that may be familiar to people who remember when Twitter was good. So this is a quip that was made actually by a satirist for The Onion, Alex Blackman. In my sci-fi author, right, in my book, I invented the Torment Nexus as a cautionary tale, right? Tech company, at long last, we have created the Torment Nexus from the classic sci-fi novel, Don't Create the Torment Nexus. Now, this joke went viral. You've probably seen it. I think the term Torment Nexus is now just kind of like widely used generically. Like in a lot of kind of cultural commentary. And it went viral because it named something that people had been noticing for years without quite having the language to kind of explain it, right? This peculiar habit of technology entrepreneurs of reaching into the canon of science fiction and fantasy, stories that are like almost without exception warnings of some kind, and treating them as instruction manuals. And so this talk is kind of about that habit. It's about what it means and what it reveals, and why taking it seriously might help us understand something important about the kind of power that these actors are trying to acquire and exercise. So I want to kind of first begin with like some examples, and then sort of step back and say a little bit about what I think the examples mean. So the kind of easiest example to reach for here is Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel is a tech entrepreneur and financier, primarily made most of his money by being one of the founders of PayPal, and making kind of big bank when that company sold. And he then founded this data analytics company called Palantir, and he called it Palantir right after the Seeing Stones in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And these are like magical objects that allow their users to surveil great distances and people, right, in real time. And obviously, in their canonical context, they are instruments of domination, right? Sauron uses them to corrupt Saruman, to break the will of Denethor. They're not neutral tools. And their danger is precisely that they appear to offer, right, knowledge and control while delivering subjugation. And Thiel knows the books extremely well. So in addition to the fact that the company is called Palantir, all of their company offices are named after like places from Tolkien: Gondor, Rivendell, the Shire. Like, you cannot make this up. He has a weapons company that he's also funded, which is called Anduril. That is Aragorn's sword, right? Like, it's very deliberate. He's clearly somebody who has closely read the book. He chose the name anyway, right? He's also somebody who has written very publicly, and, kind of has given this as like a justification for some of the interventions that he's more recently made in politics and the donations that he's made, that he is somebody who, you know, uh, believes is thought of himself once as a libertarian and now believes that freedom and democracy are incompatible, right? And so clearly presents his project as being openly anti-democratic, but not openly anti-freedom, right? That's the story that he kind of wants to tell about himself. The quote that you can see on the screen is from an essay that he wrote for the Cato Institute in 2009 when he was starting to kind of emerge, right, as a major political donor. So we can kind of talk a bit about what's going on with him. Then we might take a different character from this cast of characters that we're living with now, right? Elon Musk. Now, Musk has described his ambitions for, sort of humanity's future in terms that he has drawn very explicitly, right, from Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And in particular, he's very taken with this idea of preserving civilizational knowledge against some kind of coming dark age by establishing a colony elsewhere. And he said, this is part of the logic, right, of what he's trying to do with space settlement, right? The character who does this in Asimov, Harry Seldon, is a mathematician who develops a science of predicting the future, right? And he's also a figure of, like, in the novels, of considerable moral ambiguity, right? Whose project of saving civilization involves the calculated sacrifice, right, of billions of lives, the covert manipulation of history, right? But Musk, when he's talking about this in interviews and obviously, again, in his tweets, is presenting Seldon as some kind of straightforward hero. And I think when I started thinking about this, I was thinking really about what he was talking about vis-a-vis his companies. But obviously, we've now lived over the last year and a half through Elon Musk's entry formally into the Trump administration and then his exit from it. And this logic of, in the name of a higher civilizational calling, like great dispensing with human life is justified, is a logic that he invoked when he was running parts of the Trump administration, and in particular vis-a-vis the dismantling of USAID, which was the development agency of the United States government, and in particular by shutting it down, like just automatically millions of people in Africa in particular died because famine relief was withdrawn, and those people were entirely dependent on, right, that relief that the U.S. government was providing. And when he was asked about it, right, he said, well, we dug into it, right, and it became apparent that what we have here is not an apple with a worm in it, but actually just a ball of worms. And here he's referring to human beings as worms, right? The people who work at USAID, the people who depend on these services, the people whose lives will actually be dispensed with, when the company is dismantled. We could go on, right? We could talk about Jeff Bezos. Bezos has also invested, right, in space colonization. This is a common ambition that a number of these oligarchs share. He's talked more about being interested in the kind of the visions from the 1970s of the sort of physicist and like space advocate Gerald O'Neill. But he's also obviously a major Tolkien fan himself. I mean, one of the reasons that Amazon has invested so much money, wisely or unwisely, in the Rings of Power project is because this is a Bezos personal interest. But clearly, there are ideas that I think have science fictional echoes of trying to kind of escape from a planet, right, that has been damaged beyond repair. The fact that it's been damaged beyond repair by, right, extractive capitalism doesn't totally enter into the picture, right? But you can see these echoes in a lot of these oligarchs. I had to limit myself to how many kind of Musk quotations could appear on one slide, but there's another kind of very interesting comment that was given by Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, but where he was asked about Musk for a profile of Musk in the New Yorker very early in his kind of entry into sort of political, like explicit inside the state political action, where Altman says, Elon desperately wants the world to be saved, but only if he can be the one to save it. And so I think there's something, right, in the way that he wants to cast himself as a kind of science fictional hero, right, that we might draw from. The final one that I want to kind of highlight is one that again involves Peter Thiel, but also involves a bunch of these other larger universe of kind of tech oligarchs, and particularly financiers in the tech space who might not be as popularly well known. But they've all invested in sort of a project that they call the network state or seasteading, and sort of these ideas of creating these kind of floating cities and floating enclaves that would function as kind of corporate governed quasi states outside of the sovereignty of any like existing nation state. And a bunch of these guys talk explicitly about getting this idea idea from Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash. Again, a novel in which, right, the fragmentation of the world into kind of corporate micro sovereignties is presented like as a catastrophe, right? And so there is this pattern, right, of them leveraging, right, these kind of darker imaginaries of science fiction, speculative fiction, but in ways that maybe seem a bit torment ecstasy, right? Now, what should we do with this? Right? One way to kind of respond to all of this is to dismiss it as branding. To say these are just like really cool names. They chose them because they sound cool. These are men of a certain generation. They read these books at a formative time in their lives. And we shouldn't like overthink it. And I want to suggest that this is the wrong response. I wouldn't be giving the lecture if I didn't think it was a wrong response, but for kind of two reasons. The first is that these actors are not simply choosing science fictional names, but they're choosing science fictional projects, right? They're not just like calling their company Palantir, but they're building, right, a surveillance infrastructure that the company sells to governments for precisely the types of population monitoring and control that the fictional object after which the company is named, right, involves. Musk is not just like invoking Asimov to say like, oh, I'm a fan, right? But he's trying to establish his Mars colonization venture, right? Like around again the idea that like he's the Selden of our time, that he's a single visionary and he has a vision of human civilization's future, and everybody else is just like inconveniently kind of getting in the way, right? So the fiction maybe isn't the project, but it is doing something important in how these actors understand, narrate, legitimate the projects that they're building. Um, but the second, I think, is that the choice of which fictions to invoke and how to read them is itself potentially revealing. And here I'm kind of like actually really keen to hear from people in this room, because you guys know the universe of stories from which they're picking stories, much better than I do. And I think there's something interesting in what they choose, right, and what they don't choose, and that might help us to understand something about how these actors understand their own role in history. So I want to offer kind of two possible interpretations of this phenomenon, and and then I want to argue, I guess, that both are true in different degrees um, for different actors. So the first interpretation is that the technology oligarchs have simply like misread the canon, right? They encountered stories in which, sort of um, uh, characters are using powerful tools to vanquish their enemies and reshape the world. And they've identified with those characters, maybe even identifying with them as heroes without noticing, without caring, right? That the tools in question are presented in the origin stories as inherently corrupting, and that the world being reshaped is like often in these stories much worse, right? For the reshaping. So on this reading, right, the torment nexus is being built by people who don't understand that they're building the torment nexus. The second interpretation is much more unsettling, right? In this version, right, the actors, they've read the stories correctly, right? They actually do understand what's happening. They understand the moral valence of the figures that they invoke, but they have concluded that those villains, those characters who are usually protected as villains, were in fact right. Right? That Sauron or the Emperor or the corporations in Alien or something have the correct analysis of what power requires and how civilizations are built, and that what looks like villainy from the perspective of the person that the author of the novel might be presenting as the hero, right, is simply the willingness of like the hard man to do what was necessary. And here I think it's kind of important that um, although these are figures that in our current politics clearly have situated themselves on the political right and are in part responsible for driving the political right further to the right, um, in ways that are quite different from the rest of their fellow travelers on the political right. All of these guys believe absolutely that climate change is real and that climate change is a existential catastrophe for humanity, and it is one of the things that really recurs often in the way that they talk about themselves as kind of the hard man that the moment needs, who is willing to do what is necessary with the technology that's available and isn't afraid of it, and that these are the real heroes of the story, and everybody else is just chicken shit. And climate change is an important kind of like factor in the way that they think about that. So let's talk about them kind of in turn. Um, there is there's this sort of in my book, When Companies Rule, which is about sort of the history of kind of super powerful corporations from the East India Company up to like these Silicon Valley entities today. I describe a particular type of corporate ruler that I call sort of the utopian mode of corporate governance. So the tendency of certain types of companies, particularly ones that have like very strong founder CEOs, from kind of the paternalistic corporations of the 19th century to kind of the tech oligarchs today, to understand themselves as building within the little enclaves that they control, whether that's like tech campuses or, sort of company towns, offshore oil communities, things like that. To understand that they're building kind of modern model societies that will demonstrate to the rest of the world some better way of organizing human life. And what unites all of these actors kind of across multiple centuries, very different ideological content, very different industries, very different sort of national contexts, is a conviction that they're not just running a business, but they're piloting a kind of model future that everybody will one day thank them for having invented. And in the book, I argue that this conviction is sort of prior to and generative of, much of the governance behavior that like looks puzzling if you assume that companies and people who run them are primarily interested in maximizing their profits. So the picture that you see here is a township called Reliance Greens. It's in Western India. It's the township that houses about 20,000 people who are associated in one way or another with an oil refinery. So it's on the western coast of India because the oil is coming in right from the Gulf and being refined there and then sold partly in India and partly elsewhere in Asia. And it's a company, it's a very large company. It's like India's second or third largest company, depending when you look and what's happening in the stock market. But it is almost 50% controlled by one family. And so that family and like the founder and his descendants have been able to retain a huge amount of control of how things operate. And the family are devout Hindus, strict vegetarians. And so in this township, they initially first aggressively forbade any consumption of meat products, and then have sort of softened that, but now like highly regulate where you can have meat and like you have to eat it in secret in certain like sealed rooms and you can't have it in public. And it's because they don't want other people to kind of know about it. It's very, very strange. Um, and and they have other sort of lifestyle rules that come out of right the founding family's sort of religious convictions, having to do with like sort of gender segregation and dress and all kinds of stuff. And none of this stuff makes any sense from a profit perspective because A, it costs a lot of money to like administer and enforce, and B, every year there's a huge number of people who get fed up. They've like worked there for a couple of years. They're like, wow, this is really weird. And they leave. And then you have to like train all new people to like run your oil refinery, which is like, this is a dangerous set of machines to run. So it's like a big deal when you have to retrain all of your engineers. So there's some form of ideological commitment to these ideas that we miss when we reduce corporate power to its kind of economic logic. So I think what's distinctive about the current moment, right, is that this utopian mode has converged with science fiction, right, in a way that does seem kind of historically specific. The fictional references that they're making, I think, are different, right, from what some of the types of utopian companies that I've dealt with over the centuries have done. But then there are other ways I think maybe that it's quite similar. I think it's interesting, right, in terms of thinking about the choices of story origin that they kind of draw on. I mean, in part, this is generational because these men are all, kind of a similar age, but it's all sort of rooted in like a golden age of American science fiction and in narratives of technological mastery, sort of frontier expansion, kind of great man of history type storytelling, people reshaping history through the force of like their will and their intellect. It's a science fiction of conquest, right? Broadly understood. The conquest of space, the conquest of death, the conquest of scarcity, the conquest of the past. And so I think there's something in, right, that set of choices that we might want to like pull out and think about. This imaginary also, I think, predisposes them to read stories of power as straightforwardly heroic, right? So, when Elon Musk describes himself as trying to ensure that humanity becomes multiplanetary, he's genuinely drawing on Asimov, right? His version of it. But he's drawing on a version of it from which, like, the moral complexity, the tragedy, right, has been, like, completely removed, right? So he's, like, encountered the villain, mistaken the villain for the hero, mistaken himself for that hero, and then kind of proceeded right accordingly. And it's it's something more than just profit seeking because they're engaging in stuff that doesn't always make sense. A lot of these companies are money losing. But at the same time, it's a function of there's a function of their economic power that enables them to do this, right? When you have enough money to imagine things and make them real, you can afford to skip the parts of the story that you don't like. But I don't think that misreading alone explains what we're looking at because I think some of these actors have been kind of more explicit about some of the darker implications of what they're doing. And here I think that like Peter Thiel and the fact that like he's very deliberate, very explicit, has spoken about um, the logic of why he's using these Tolkien images on purpose. Um, I think is doing something quite deliberate where like he does actually just think that we're all wrong about who the heroes of these stories are. And that when he talks about sort of I'm pursuing some higher version of freedom, and that version of freedom is in some way incompatible with democracy, right? He's actually making a claim about freedom requires there to be like some person enforcing a certain kind of unfreedom within which freedom is contained. And that's a real that's like a real normative conviction that they're advancing through these stories that I think we have to kind of take seriously. Peter Thiel is somebody who also has like spoken about some of the political theorists that he's actually reading, and he's reading people who have essentially made that argument, sort of a kind of Hobbesian argument that there needs to be somebody like that sitting outside of our free choices to make them possible. It's not for nothing that these are the same political theorists that often a lot of far right movements in history, right, have kind of made um, use of. So I am starting to play with the idea of fictional capture as a kind of concept for what I'm describing, and um, you know this is a sort of generalization of the torment nexus phenomenon, right? A systematic process by which, right, a critical or cautionary fiction is recruited in the service of precisely the project that it was warding against. And I think fictional capture is doing something, kind of real ideational work in sort of three ways, right? First, it naturalizes these actors' vision of the future. So by dressing their projects in the vocabulary of beloved, culturally authoritative stories, technology oligarchs embed their ambitions within a narrative framework that audiences already find compelling, right? There's going to be a certain number of people who just realize that these companies are named after things from books that they like and are like, oh, cool. Um, so, space colonization doesn't need to be argued for from first principles, right? If it can be associated with certain emotional resonances of kind of cultural works that generations of people grew up with. The fiction kind of pre-sells the product. Second, it shapes the self-understanding of a transnational class of technology elites. So Silicon Valley has its own cultural formation, its own reading lists, its reference points, its in-group vocabularies, and the imaginary I've been describing is kind of central to that formation, right? It tells the people within it who they are, what they're doing, why it matters. It gives them a sense of purpose. Um, and so, in that sense, in the really precise scholarly sense, it's an ideology, right? A structured set of beliefs about the world and one's place in it that shapes behavior in ways that are not always consciously articulated. And third, and I think most importantly for how we kind of study these actors. Sorry, I went forward before I wanted to there. Um, it forecloses certain futures and it like opens up others, right? So when the dominant imaginary available to people who are building the technological infrastructure on which so much of our social infrastructure depends, right, is one in which concentrated power, frontier conquest, the displacement of existing populations is heroic, and the alternatives that might be more distributed, more accountable, more democratic become, right, are not sort of there, right, those imaginaries become literally unimaginable. They fall outside the stories that are being told, and therefore they fall outside the political possibilities that are like arising for us. I think it's sort of in the realm of like, it's interesting what they choose to read. I think it's very notable that, sort of the science fiction canon authors of the same period as the ones they choose that do not ever appear on their reading list um, are Octavia Butler and Ursula Le Guin. And some of that is just because these are men and they don't read women. But some of that I think has something to do with the types of stories that are being told in those works and the way that they are not, right, susceptible to fictional capture in this way. So I've been making kind of what sounds like a literary argument, but I want to be clear that I think this has real implications for understanding the empirical politics of the current moment. And so, in some of my recent work, I've been developing an idea of sort of oligarchic sovereignty, um, which argues, right, that these technology oligarchs and maybe other oligarchs are trying to assert kind of new forms of political authority over territory, infrastructure, and the law through space colonization, through seasteading, through these projects that have like real territorial ambitions of like we're creating actual spaces where we'll run systems that just bypass the state entirely. This is also obviously part of the appeal of cryptocurrency as a sort of private payment system that they think they can operate outside of central bank oversight. Um, and and this isn't totally new, right? So corporate rulers kind of going back not only to like the paternalistic factory owners that we talked about already, but also to kind of sovereign corporations like the East India Company, who like ruled over whole countries with private armies and private currency and so on. One of the arguments that I make in the book is that these companies never sustain their authority through coercion alone. They often sustain it, at least in part, through legitimacy, through the capacity to persuade the people that they govern, publics who are observing them, that their rule is in some sense justified. And the science fictional imaginary maybe provides, right, a legitimating vocabulary for the particular version of corporate sovereignty that we're living through now. So here you can see a couple of quotes from the kind of East India Company period, of, right, the company's ambition to like describe itself absolutely as a sovereign, but then kind of critics who were observing the company at that time, whether Thomas Hobbes or Edmund Burke, recognizing that these companies were doing something that was clearly not only parasitic on the sovereignty of states and rivaling the sovereignty of states. That's what Hobbes is concerned about, right? They're lesser commonwealths in the belly of the greater, like worms in the entrails of a natural man, but also in some way parasitic on the rights of individuals, because they're claiming the corporation and the people who run it as having, sort of, they have rights, right? They have rights, they have corporate rights, and therefore you can't regulate them. And this is an argument that the East India Company was actually making to British regulators at the time. It should remind us, I think, of some of the claims for being literal persons and having speech rights and so on that companies make now. And where Burke is saying, look, that's parasitic on the rights of individuals because human rights belong to humans. Um, and I think one of the things that's interesting about going back to that period, and this is sort of where the title of this talk comes from, is that at the time, right, there was a distinction in the early modern period between, sort of like today we talk about public and private as though the public realm is the state and the private realm is people and also companies. But in the early modern period, they talked about it differently. They talked about the private realm as just being individuals and the public realm as being like all collective organizations where corporations, the church, the state are all competing with each other. And one of the things that troubled them about sort of these corporations with the ruling aspirations, is that they were trying to kind of be on both sides of that line, right? That they were trying to be both people and also state-like entities at the same time. But at the time, right, this is the 1600s, the 1700s, there were people who got to be something other than human beings. And those people were monarchs, right? Monarchs got to be both like the literal human that is sitting on the throne at the time, and then like the corporate entity of the crown that exists even as the people who are in it change. If you've watched the television series The Crown, it's actually very good at explaining this concept. Whoever was writing it has actually read some of the work, and so they would talk about the king as having like two bodies, the literal body and then like the crown body. And so when these technology oligarchs are asserting sort of their rights in the language that they do, right, they're positioning both their companies as sort of latter-day corporate sovereigns on the model of the East India Company, but they're also positioning themselves, right, as latter-day kings. And they're wanting to play both of these early modern roles at the same time, and not even the East India Company ever tried to do that. And so I sort of expound this particular aspect a little bit more in this article that came out late last year, Oligarchic Sovereignty. Thanks to the University of Glasgow, it is free to read, and open access, so you can just go and read it. Um, So I think what is new to some extent is the scale, the speed, right? The availability of, right, particular cultural resources. But I think many of the ideas, many of the phenomena that we're talking about actually are sort of repeating from these kind of historical contexts. So I want to close by drawing out what I think are some of the um, implications, right, for scholarship. And obviously, I am a social scientist and a scholar of politics. So some of these implications I think are really maybe for my fellow social scientists, but some of them are maybe for us all. Um, the first implication is kind of methodological, right? If we want to understand how these actors legitimate their power, we need to take their cultural production seriously, not just kind of the types of textual outputs from companies that scholars of companies are used to looking at, like their lobbying disclosures, their political donations, their corporate filings, and their public statements, but also, their kind of reading list, their named projects, the stories they tell about themselves and their ambitions. Ideology has always done political work, but understanding it, I think, does require attending to a slightly different type of texts through which it is expressed. All of this is to say that, like, I have spent a lot of time reeling Elon Musk's tweets, and I would defend that as like legitimate research, although it was not fun for me. Um, the second implication is theoretical. So in my work on oligarchic sovereignty, I've argued that we kind of need to expand our toolkit of thinking about political power to account for these actors who are exerting political authority in ways that our frameworks of political authority that are based on the state sometimes struggle to capture. And so, fictional capture is a way for me to try and start thinking about that, right? And thinking about sort of how these imaginaries are doing actual infrastructural work in legitimating their projects and getting people to buy into those projects and then allowing those projects to exist. And that maybe understanding that, right, will allow us to also understand how it might be challenged. The third implication is more normative, right? That the stories being co-opted, many of them were written as warnings. The critical tradition in science fiction has spent, right, the better part of a century imagining in vivid detail, right, what concentrated unaccountable power looks like, and concluding repeatedly, right, that it's bad. And there's a kind of resource there for scholars and for publics, maybe in reclaiming these stories and in kind of reparative readings that speak back to the readings that these oligarchs are giving us. And so in some ways, the answer to fictional capture is at least in part better reading. Um, so I want to kind of stop there. I extrapolate some of these arguments in more detail and with slightly different science fictional examples. I left, a lot on the cutting room floor in the book. You can get a 20% discount on it if you order it directly with this discount code, and it will be out in November. I'm really looking forward to comments and discussion.